During the year of 1965, the March on Selma, carrying all the way into Montgomery, Alabama, and leading to Bloody Sunday, was a series of substantial efforts by African Americans to earn equal rights. On March 21st through 25th, the long 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery took place. The protest consisted of 4 different campsites known as David Hall Farm, Rosie Steele Farm, Robert Gardner Farm, and the city of St. Jude, all which became a safe haven for African protesters to get away from the chaos happening in the world around them. This civil rights movement was led by many protesting groups. However, the most influential activist during this time was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He led thousands of nonviolent demonstrators to the steps of the Capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, after 5 long days of marching, where local African Americans, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had been campaigning for voting rights. On January 2, 1965, King Jr. and the SCLC joined the SNCC, the Dallas Country Voters League, and other local African American activists in a voting rights campaign in Selma, where in spite of repeated registration attempts by local blacks, only 2% were on voting rolls. A small number of the protesting groups tried to focus their efforts on Selma due to the anticipation of notorious police brutality that would break out. African Americans strived for it to reach national news levels so that President Johnson and Congress would have no other decision but to enact new national voting laws. On March 9th, known as Turnaround Tuesday, was a day full of confusion, rumors, and uncertainty during the SNCC training and protesting in Dallas. This event took over national news after leaders of the movement, Reverend James Reeb, and 2 others were attacked by 4 white men, resulting in Reeb's death. After this tragic event, it became clear that the federal government had an important role to play in our nation's civil rights movement and in efforts to fully enforce the equality principles enshrined within the 14th and 15th Amendment. Groups of activists looked for leadership within government buildings and were finally beginning to see a breakthrough in their favor. Following the enforcement of African Americans' right to vote was white landowner retaliation against tenant farmers who registered, voted, or even engaged in any voting rights activities by throwing them off their land. Homeless farmers and their families found refuge with the help of the SNCC and Loudness County leaders. Citizens bought tents, coats, heaters, food, and water, and helped several families build a temporary tent city. Despite resident harassment, the tent city persevered for almost 2 years as African Americans searched for jobs and permanent housing. Continuing during this time period, on January 9th in Selma, Alabama, a day known as Bloody Sunday took place on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. United States troops stormed the bridge, declaring that every man and woman was to be off the bridge and back to their house or into the church in at least 2 minutes. The church at this time was the only place that it was safe and legal for African Americans to protest. Protesters refused to listen to these orders, resulting in an outbreak of violence by the state troopers, who advanced hitting marchers with their nightsticks. They released tear gas and continued with whips, nightsticks, and rubber tubes to drive the marchers off through the streets of Selma. This outrage drew the attention of not only government officials, but also innocent bystanders around the country, sparking a new revolution against the inequality of voting rights. Finally, the day that African Americans had been hoping and dreaming for had become an exciting reality. On August 6, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into power, along with the 15th Amendment. This made it legal for anyone anywhere to deny someone of any race the legal right to vote. Unfortunately, voter discrimination continues during the modern times of the 21st century. Through the illegal practice of gerrymandering, weakening of the Voting Rights Act and voter identification requirements, minorities struggle and are deprived of their voting rights. Although states like Iowa and South Dakota have been known for making it harder for people with past criminal convictions to regain their voting rights, there are also innocent citizens being discriminated against. When it comes to voting, states such as North Carolina, Georgia, Kansas, Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, and Arizona, along with others, are revoking privileges of Americans. Georgia, for example, cut its early voting period by more than half for 2012. In effect, the reduction in voting periods for citizens creates longer lines at the poll and is more time-consuming for working adults such as low-income parents working multiple jobs. Oftentimes, adults are unable to vote at all because of the lower class inability to take time out of the office. In the case of North Carolina, which reduced the number of polling places in previous years, even a small impact made a significant difference. Due to socioeconomic disparities, these types of restrictions disproportionately impact minority voters. In terms of voter identification, Alabama passed a legislature in 2011 requiring voters to present photo identification before casting a ballot and was estimated to disenfranchise between 250,000 and 500,000 voters. Furthermore, the U.S. Supreme Court has altered the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby Court v. County Holder decision. States freed from federal oversight have taken license to discriminate, and Texas lawmakers drew House districts to intentionally discriminate against minority voters. Because minority Americans tend to vote Democrat, these restrictions gave Republicans an advantage that would otherwise not. Specific examples of these restrictions consist of voter ID requirements, early voting cuts, new requirements to register to vote, limits on mail-in ballots, provisional and absentee voting changes, polling place closures, and voter roll purges. Voter ID requirements pass new laws that require voters to prove their identity with a voter ID. Indiana specifically passed a law letting party-nominated election officers demand voter IDs at the polls. Strict voter ID laws requiring identification cast a ballot to reduce turnout, which tends to work in the Republicans' favor. Researchers found that these laws doubled the turnout gap between whites and Latinos in the general elections, and almost doubled the white-black turnout group in primary elections. Another form of voting discrimination that is commonly seen in present-day America is early voting cuts. For instance, in the state of Ohio, a whole week from early voting was cut out, eliminating the Golden Week, in which voters could register and vote on the same day. This takes away early voting abilities, which makes up just a little under half of the total percentage that vote in each election. New requirements to register to vote in the state of Kansas. State government officials passed a law that requires new voters to show proof of citizenship to be eligible to vote. Following in the footsteps of Kansas, the state of Virginia also required groups submitting 25 or more voter registration forms to register with the state, and reduced the amount of time to individuals had delivered the forms from offices or ballots by 5 days. Limiting this time from 15 to 10 days may not seem like a dramatic difference, but the crowds then began to enter the polls at all the wrong times, becoming overcrowded, resulting in many citizens not being able to cast their votes. Limits on mail-in ballots made it a felony to collect and turn in someone else's mail-in ballot, even with the voter's permission. This prevents citizens who do not have enough time to visit the polls from voting.